Good afternoon. So I'm going to be talking this afternoon about the second project that Rezatec has been involved in, which is the satellite applications of precision plant health information response and evaluation, which wonderfully fits into Sapphire. So in terms of our objectives for this project, we were working with Forest Research on this project, and the primary objective for the organisation was highlighted as being the ability to understand all the difficulties associated with obtaining accurate information about the precise distribution of tree species, which in itself may sound relatively straightforward as an objective, but it's very important to understand that while products such as the National Forest Inventory give you an indication of the location of known woodland blocks, the actual information as to the structure, the density, and the precise distribution of those species, primarily deciduous species, as coniferous are far easier to distinguish. Broadleaf species are much harder, and that ability to obtain contemporary information, up-to-date information, is really key when it comes to understanding the distribution of pests and pathogens. Many of you may be aware in the media of spread of diseases such as Phytophthora and sudden oak death. A lot of those of ongoing diseases, but have been made incredibly relevant recently. And we wanted to address this issue of identifying an accurate tree species classification and understanding the phenological characterization of those species in order to understand the sort of multi-temporal aspect of how these woodland blocks are changing with time, which could give an indication of stress or disease. I'd love to go take you into an interactive map and show all of these woodlands in more detail, but our primary focus for this study, this feasibility study, was both ash and oak species, oak on the left and ash on the right. So using some ground sample data, we were able to use machine learning algorithms to accurately map to a high precision the spatial location, and the scale here is canopy cover. So we're looking at sort of an indicative measure of density rather than just specifying exactly where a tree is. We're looking at the relative abundance of each of these two species. And mapping those across a number of woodlands that we used for our area of interest, which range from the Alice Holt woodland up in the top right, down to the New Forest down in the southwest. In order to develop this model, we used standard field-based measurements. So this is measurements that are routinely collected by Forest Research as part of their ongoing monitoring and forest inventory activities. Primarily based around diameter at breast height. And it's important that we use sort of ongoing measures because these are available historically, and as I mentioned, they're routinely collected, so we're not having to require additional metrics or more detailed metrics of the trees in order to derive a very accurate product. And the key factor that we did use in order to derive these products was the use, as you've heard before, of the new Sentinel-1 series. And because the SAR time series, with its high revisit and its relatively high spectral resolution, means that although we've, for this feasibility, we've mapped relatively a small area, you could do this on a national scale and start to understand not only the location of trees, but as I mentioned, their density and how that then changes with time. And I'll go on to the temporal aspect next. So with its 12 and soon to be 6-day revisit period, you can start to extract the baseline phenological behavior, or the annual cycle with which the deciduous species goes through. And once we successfully extracted that baseline behavior, we could then understand how any species within our mapped extent, which is being updated regularly, when we know where that extent is, we can start to monitor the individual parcels and understand where certain pixels in this, which indicate a number of trees within a stand, are starting to deviate away from this baseline behavior. And this can be very important, as it can show that It might just be natural variation, that's understandable within a tree species due to local conditions. But if we split this into 3 sections within the year, the rate of leaf on, the peak period, and the rate of leaf off. And if you start to notice an indicative trend in the same direction for the same block across your year, you can start to link that to unusual behavior, which could be an early sign of one of the pathogens or pests that I mentioned before. So we did detect some deviations within these woodland blocks for both of the 2 species, and this can be used to improve the sort of ground tasking and send teams to investigate if there's a significant trend, because we're getting a measure of magnitude as well as precision location. You can start to identify hotspots of change, which are potentially the very start of one of the pests I mentioned before. So the advantages of working with Forest Research, and they've been very kind, they've engaged with us well, and we've been able to share contacts, which has improved our networking and our engagement with other forestry management organisations and plant health stakeholders. And it's allowed us to start to develop these products that we've started through this feasibility study and engage with other end users such as public but also private, such as John Clegg. And even next week we've got a workshop where we're going to demonstrate some of these results and try and sort of engage in ways that we could either go further with these or start to explore different avenues. As I mentioned, we only explored 2 species here. There's a scope to go for more species that are of interest, as well as outside of the area of interest that we started with. In terms of benefits to the end user, I guess one of the greatest limitations at the moment is the ability to acquire regular, up-to-date information on tree species location and integrate this into the operational model and ongoing activities within any organisation. As has been illustrated today, the UK is well placed in its global market with understanding how EO is being utilised in these market sectors. And there's a huge growth sector and ability of customers to understand the importance of these, or as we call them, intelligent customers, understanding the way that EO can be incorporated into a business workflow. And it's estimated that in terms of the forest inventory that I mentioned, where the data is collected to gain parameters such as the diameter, breast height, and species classification, on a per hectare basis, this is in the region of 44 pounds per hectare. So, as an example, for the Ellis Holt woodland, say there's 20 to 30 sample sites, and they're for different purposes, but if they're visited every 5 years, you can imagine how the costs start to build up significantly if you try to expand this over a much larger network, including nationally owned and private woodlands. So the cost of between 5 and 10% of the 3.5 million hectares of forestry in the UK, you can quickly add up that this is a significant cost to that manual element or that human element of going out and creating this inventory in the first place. So if we could incorporate EO into that service, that could significantly reduce the aspects, especially in areas which are more remote or where revisit periods for ground-based monitoring are not as regular. And in terms of how we would deliver this as a business model, as Phil mentioned earlier, we have a subscription-based service which is online, where we deliver our products. And it allows the user to interrogate not only the initial data sets, so the level 1 product, which is your classification. This would be updated as required by the user. There is the potential to do it every month, but you could do it as regularly as required. And then there's also the ability to add these sort of additional information data layers, such as your detection of the change in phenological behavior. And then it's up to the end user then to interpret that information, that high-level information, and prioritize then as part of that operational workflow where the ground-based teams are sent. And it can be then used to model the likely spread of pathogens where they've been successfully identified and try to capture these early on. So in terms of where we're going to go next with this, it's been really useful for us to learn how to incorporate the European satellites, the Sentinel-1 series, as well as the Sentinel-2, and incorporate this alongside, as I mentioned, the standard survey ground-based techniques to create a single landscape intelligence tool focusing on both the tree species distribution and the ongoing multi-temporal condition. In terms of what's been gained through the SSPG involvement, the ability to work with forest research has been incredibly beneficial for us in terms of understanding the UK public sector woodland management and the operational factors that are involved with that, and understanding more the efficiency that's required with the location of pathogens and understanding their relative spread. In terms of where we go with this in the future, we'd like, as I mentioned, to incorporate other species into the model, try and capture, as well as the coniferous, more of the broadleaf species, and roll this out across a national scale, and make this into an operational product by which, as new information is acquired on that 6 to 12 day basis, we can provide analytics more regularly to the end user, and because the sooner the information is achieved, then the sooner any action can take place, which is vital for when it comes to the spread of pathogens. Sorry, 1 second, struggling to... Oh, okay, yeah. So different commercial companies can be approached, and as I mentioned, we've got the workshop on the 14th, and we're hoping to engage with also, as well as the public sector, but also the private sector agencies who do some of this ground field work, and understand the benefits that can be gained through collaboration with multiple agencies. So in conclusion, it was identified early on that there's limited data on the precise location of certain tree species and their distribution, and this significantly hinders the modelling and understanding of the spread of certain pathogens. And in understanding that problem, we developed a solution through the use of timely optical and SAR-derived sensors to create up-to-date classifications, and which could be directly fed into an operational monitoring service for tree plant condition. And the benefit is, as I mentioned, the financial benefit of the per hectare reduced cost of the ongoing forest inventory work. And we hope to go further with this and sort of engage with a number of different clients across the UK and get this rolling on further. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions for Alisdair or his colleagues in regard to the Sapphire project? One on this side, thanks.
Hi, Matt Dre from Plant Health at DEFRA. So you mentioned the model was 80% accurate for oak, for example, which is really good actually. But do you have any sense of what oak was being mistaken for in that extra kind of 20%? Was it one particular species or a couple of species over and over, or was it just sort of getting confused by a range of things?
From the ground data that we had, it purely depends on the sort of as you mentioned, the other species that are in the vicinity, and also the age of the stand. There was some confusion with larch that appeared, but it was very sporadic throughout the stand. So the sort of density of the stand and the pureness of the stand does impact on that accuracy, yes.
Any other questions for Alisdair? One at the back.
Hi, Alisdair. Yeah, Crispin Habbage, EA. Just wondering if you have any idea about what effect regional climatic variations would have on, because this is very heavily dependent on the temporal changes in the vegetation, and what kind of impact are those so in the north of the country compared to the south of the country, uplands versus lowlands?
That's a very good question. So in terms of the temporal baseline, we would make sure that we established a regional temporal baseline as opposed to a national one, to understand, as you mentioned, the difference that local climatologies would have on the growing cycle. So it's not assumed that the single baseline, it would be applied based purely on the sort of climatic
I think that's everything. Thanks, Alistair. Thank you very much.